The rain had the delicacy of a silk veil drawn across the streets of Bloomsbury. Thin, deliberate, faintly theatrical. Within the old Winthrop Opera House, however, the damp November evening had been banished by chandeliers, a warm hum of conversation, and the particular glow that attends an invitation-only rehearsal preview. The opera, The Unfinished, was the final work of Maestro Dorian Hargrave, the eccentric composer whose talent, temper, and taste for melodrama were legend in equal measure. Tonight, the elite of London's artistic circle drifted through the marble lobby, a mixture of titled patrons, ambitious performers, and those curious individuals who lived perennially on the border between art and society. They mingled with the contained enthusiasm of people who knew they were expected to be interesting at all times. Inspector Roderick Alleyn stood near a vase of white lilies, looking as though he had wandered in by accident and was content to observe until given a reason otherwise. In truth, he'd been invited, coaxed might be a more accurate word, by Lady Amabel Kerridge, the opera's principal patroness and an indefatigable woman who considered it her personal mission to drag culture into every corner of London, including Scotland Yard. "My dear Inspector," she'd said earlier, fluttering her pearls with the urgency of a distressed pigeon, "you simply must attend. Dorian is, I hardly know how to put it, delicate these days. The strain of finishing the opera, or rather not finishing it, has left him in a perpetual state of poetic nerves." So Alleyn had come, not as a policeman but as an observer, though even in leisure he could not help noticing things. A young soprano in rose-colored silk stood stiffly beside an older woman whose disapproving stare might have wilted stronger personalities. A trio of students from the Royal Academy whispered behind their programs, glancing repeatedly toward the stairwell. An elderly baronet inspected the artwork on the walls with such exaggerated interest that one might suspect he hoped not to be spoken to. And then there was Dorian Hargrave himself. Tall, silver-haired, and wrapped in a black velvet coat that suggested he had dressed for his own legend. His eyes glittered too brightly tonight. His hands fluttered as he spoke to the conductor, as if plucking invisible threads of music from the air. There was something brittle in him, Alleyn thought, something that echoed the faint tremor in the chandeliers. The opera house buzzed with exquisite tension. It was not quite excitement, not quite dread. Something subtler, a sense of people waiting for a note that had not yet been struck. Lady Amabel swept up to Alleyn with the triumphant air of one who has secured a prized ornament. "There you are. I feared you'd escaped." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "You see how he is. Dorian, positively feverish. And dear Claudia, the soprano, seems on the verge of tears again. One can hardly blame her. The role is fiendishly difficult." Alleyn followed her glance to Claudia Bellamy, the young star. She smiled as patrons passed, but it was a smile without warmth, one maintained through sheer stamina. Her gaze drifted repeatedly toward the stage door as though she expected someone, or feared them. "Artistic temperament," Alleyn murmured. Amabel sighed. "If only it were just that. No, there's some quarrel brewing among the cast. I know the signs. They're all dreadfully polite about it, of course. But the atmosphere—" She fluttered her hand, as though shaping the air into a word she could not quite grasp. "Fragile," Alleyn supplied. She nodded. "Exactly." A small commotion drew their attention. The house manager, a square, quiet man named Mr. Penworth, was speaking tersely with Maestro Hargrave. Hargrave's voice rose just enough for a few nearby guests to turn their heads. Penworth looked uncomfortable, even distressed. Hargrave looked incandescent. "Ah," Lady Amabel murmured. "There it is." Hargrave broke away abruptly and strode toward the stage entrance, his footsteps sharp against the polished floor. The crowd registered the moment with that peculiar hush shared by those who enjoy drama only when it is meant to be seen. A moment later, the conductor, Mr. Lionel Dane appeared in the lobby, smoothing his hair with visible irritation. He spotted Alleyn and gave a brief, courteous nod, a man used to maintaining dignity even when harried. "Trouble?" Alleyn asked quietly as Dane passed. Dane hesitated, then replied in a voice trained to conceal emotion, "Merely a discussion regarding timing. Dorian dislikes being advised. I dislike being managed, a minor artistic difference." But his eyes said otherwise. Something had gone wrong, or had been wrong for some time. The rehearsal bell chimed gently, a sound far too elegant to suggest urgency, and guests drifted toward the velvet seats of the private box level. The atmosphere felt heavier now, as though the earlier tension had found a focal point deep within the shadows of the stage. Alleyn took his seat beside Lady Amabel and glanced once more toward the stage door. It had closed behind Maestro Hargrave with surprising finality. Somewhere in the opera house, perhaps backstage, perhaps only in the imaginations of those present, something had already begun to unravel. And Alleyn, without yet knowing why, felt the first faint stirrings of a case quietly taking shape. The performance began with muted grandeur, the hush of anticipation settling over the private boxes like a soft mist. The overture, delicate and hesitant, seemed to echo the unease Alleyn had already sensed. He watched the singers move through the dim light, noting the perfection of their technique, the tension coiled beneath practiced gestures. Claudia Bellamy, radiant in pale silk, executed each phrase with mechanical precision. Yet her eyes flickered constantly toward the stage door, restless, apprehensive. During the first interlude, Alleyn rose to stretch, gliding quietly down the aisle. The velvet seats absorbed the sound of his steps, and he noticed, as always, the small details. A faintly smudged handkerchief on a chair, the precise angle of a conductor's baton resting on a music stand, a faint scent of ink and roses lingering in the air. Each trace was innocuous enough alone, but together they formed the faintest undertone of disorder. It was Penworth who found the body. He emerged from the side corridor, his usually composed face pallid. Alleyn had learned to watch first for the manner in which someone discovered calamity, the hesitation, the careful choice of words, the involuntary tremor, and Penworth betrayed none of his usual control. "Inspector," he called softly, as though speaking too loudly might fracture the fragile world of the opera house entirely. Alleyn followed him through the dimly lit backstage corridors. The walls, adorned with fading posters of past triumphs, seemed to bend inward with quiet menace. And there, behind a partially closed curtain in the rehearsal room, lay Maestro Hargrave. He was not sprawled dramatically. He did not cry out. He lay with careful elegance, as if pausing mid-thought in a final private rehearsal. His hand rested lightly on the edge of the piano, his face calm in a way that contrasted grotesquely with the pallor creeping across his skin. Alleyn noted the small details that revealed more than theatrics ever could. A single sheet of music, folded and slightly torn, lay on the floor beside him. The velvet coat was pristine, and the faintest trace of perspiration gleamed on the composer's brow. Alleyn knelt briefly, though with no sense of intrusion. He examined Hargrave's posture, the subtle slackening of muscles, the minuscule tension around the jaw. There was no sign of violence, no wounds, no struggle. And yet the quiet horror of death, deliberate and precise, radiated from him like the faint hum of a distant chord. Claudia Bellamy had been summoned, and now hovered near the doorway, her fingers entwined in the folds of her skirt. She spoke in a voice that was at once steady and fragile. He wasn't feeling well. I thought he had gone to his study." Alleyn inclined his head politely. "Do you often observe his habits closely?" She hesitated. Perhaps too closely. He was particular about his routines. Anything amiss would distress him. The inspector's eyes lingered on her for a moment, not accusing, merely observing. He noted the tremor in her voice, the small crease of concern between her brows, the subtle way she kept her distance. It spoke of care, fear, and perhaps something deeper, but not yet accusation. Penworth spoke again, more controlled this time. "There's no sign of struggle. Nothing. Seems disturbed. It is as if he simply stopped." Alleyn nodded. Indeed, the scene was unsettling, not because it shouted, but because it whispered. The absence of chaos, the careful composition of the final tableau, made the tragedy more potent. The death, so quiet and restrained, carried a dignity that was almost intolerable. And yet Alleyn sensed it had been orchestrated, not accidental. He allowed a silence to linger, letting the other's nervous energy settle upon him. In the hushed room, the opera's melody seemed to persist faintly from the rehearsal hall, a ghostly accompaniment to the stillness. "Keep the room as it is," Alleyn instructed softly. "No one must touch anything until we understand more." As Penworth bowed and retreated, Claudia glanced once more at the body, then toward the stage door. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that the fragile order of the opera house had already begun to fracture. Alleyn observed this too, and as he straightened, the faintest edge of calculation settled into his mind. A quiet death, he thought, often reveals more than a scream ever could. Outside the rehearsal room, the guests murmured among themselves, unaware of the magnitude of what had occurred. Inside, the shadow of something unresolved had already begun its slow, elegant work. Alleyn's eyes, calm yet unyielding, traced the contours of the room and its occupants. He understood that in this world, the world of perfection, etiquette, and polished surfaces, the first whisper of disorder was often the most telling. And so he waited, with the patience of a conductor who has long known that the final note of a symphony is never hurried. Alleyn remained in the rehearsal room long after Penworth and Claudia had departed, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. He did not touch the piano, nor disturb the scattered sheets of music. He allowed the room itself to speak. The faint scent of Hargrave's cologne lingered, a sharp, woody note that seemed to hold the memory of countless rehearsals. Dust motes floated in the lamplight, slow and deliberate, like tiny witnesses. He took note of the objects in the room with his usual meticulous attention. A metronome, still ticking faintly, had been nudged slightly to the left of the piano. An oversight or a clue? Alleyn could not yet decide. The chairs were positioned as though the room had been arranged in a particular order, each an unintentional testament to Hargrave's precise habits. The curtains, heavy and deep red, hung straight, undisturbed. The entire tableau suggested that the death had been anticipated, almost choreographed, yet nothing overtly pointed to its cause. Alleyn's attention drifted to the doorway. From this vantage, he could see glimpses of the stage beyond, props stacked carefully, the faint glimmer of polished brass instruments, the silhouettes of a few stage hands lingering in the shadows. None were acting. Strangely, yet the presence of these quiet observers weighed upon him. In such matters, he had long learned the silent witness often retained more knowledge than the articulate participant. He moved slowly among the objects, mentally cataloguing the minor inconsistencies. A chair slightly closer to the piano than usual. A door left ajar that was generally kept closed. The smallest details, when combined, painted a picture of subtle disturbance. Outside, footsteps approached, soft, deliberate, measured. Alleyn turned slightly as a young woman appeared at the threshold. Claudia Bellamy's expression was composed, but her hands betrayed a faint tremor. She had the elegance of training, yet the nervous tension of someone who feared being too late. "Inspector," she said softly, "I thought I might assist if there's anything I can do." Alleyn inclined his head. "Your concern is appreciated, Miss Bellamy. but at present I prefer observation to interference. Tell me, were there any changes in Maestro Hargrave's routine this week? Claudia hesitated, her gaze lowering for a brief moment before meeting his eyes again. Minor changes. He rehearsed late more often than usual, and he became increasingly particular about timing. 1 second too early or too late could unsettle him. He was obsessed with perfection. Obsession can be dangerous, Alleyn murmured, not as a warning, but as an observation. His mind catalogued the information with the precision of a librarian noting a misplaced book. She nodded. I sensed it. Something was different, but I did not expect. She faltered, the words dissolving. Alleyn made no attempt to console. Silence, he knew, often elicited more than words. Claudia's gaze flicked again to the piano, to the scattered sheet music. A fleeting shadow crossed her features. Fear, guilt, uncertainty. Or perhaps all three. From the far corner of the room, Penworth reappeared, his steps measured but slower now, as if he felt the gravity of the space. He said nothing. He did not need to. Alan's attention caught the slight stiffness of his posture, the careful avoidance of eye contact. The butler's restraint, Alleyn knew, was the first layer of truth in a world of politeness and artifice. Alan's thoughts drifted back to Hargrave's peculiarities. The meticulous arrangements, the obsession with order, the fragile threads of control he exerted over the opera. There was a pattern, subtle and almost imperceptible, embedded in the maestro's life. Alleyn did not yet understand it fully, but the pieces were beginning to align. For the first time, he allowed himself a quiet reflection. In a house such as this, in a world so devoted to appearances and etiquette, the smallest deviation from routine could signal something far graver than simple eccentricity. And the most unassuming detail, the one least likely to attract attention, often bore the heaviest truth. Alleyn straightened, letting his gaze sweep the room one final time. He would not speak yet, not until he had fully observed, catalogued, and understood. Questions, when asked too soon, often disturb the fragile equilibrium of human behavior. Observation, patience, and quiet deduction, that was the way. The faint echo of the rehearsal, the gentle hum of unseen instruments, the muted rustle of the curtains. All spoke in hushed tones, and Alleyn, calm, courteous, unyielding, listened. He knew that the answer, like the maestro's final notes, would arrive not with a dramatic flourish, but in a soft, inevitable cadence. By mid-morning, the Winthrop Opera House had emptied of its privileged spectators, leaving only the staff and a handful of key performers. Alleyn remained on the premises, wandering quietly through corridors that smelled faintly of varnish and dust, observing the subtle choreography of servants and artists alike. Each movement, each gesture, seemed measured against a strict social script. But in those measurements lay the faint tremors of unspoken tensions. He began with Claudia Bellamy, now seated in a small dressing room illuminated by pale winter light. Her face was composed, though the faint shadow beneath her eyes betrayed a restless night. Miss Bellamy, Alleyn said, I would like to know more about the maestro's final days. Tell me who visited him most frequently, and were there any disagreements you observed? Claudia's fingers twisted the silk edge of her skirt. Disagreements? Only minor ones. Maestro Hargrave was easily ruffled. He preferred the pianissimo of solitude. Visitors disturbed him, but they were all polite. Patrons, conductors, occasionally performers. Everyone respected his moods. Well, nearly everyone. She paused, choosing her words carefully. He had a quarrel with Mr. Lionel Dane, the conductor, over timing, but I do not think it was serious. At least it never seemed so to me. Alleyn inclined his head. You are naturally polite, but you do notice things, do you not? Yes, of course, she admitted softly. It is impossible not to. One becomes sensitive to the maestro's moods. They shape the air of the room. Alleyn made a mental note. Sensitivity to mood, obsession with timing, a life conducted like a score, where a single note out of place could unsettle the whole. Yet no outward evidence of motive appeared. Next, he spoke with Lionel Dane. The conductor sat in the dim light of his private office, hands clasped, posture taut. "Mr. Dane," Alleyn began, "were there any conflicts backstage beyond what Miss Bellamy has mentioned?" Dane gave a small, controlled sigh. "Minor differences of opinion, Inspector. Dorian had strong ideas. I had others. Artists clash. It is inevitable. But nothing serious, I assure you." Alleyn observed him, noting the slight tremor in the fingers, the tight line of the jaw, the way he avoided eye contact when speaking of Hargrave. He said nothing further, allowing the silence to speak, letting the conductor reveal more in his restraint than he could in words. From the corridors came the soft murmur of other staff. Stage hands, wardrobe assistants, a solitary costume designer. Each was questioned with careful politeness, each answered with equal careful evasion. Yet even in their politeness, Alleyn discerned a tension, a quiet allegiance to secrets not their own. No one lied exactly. They simply omitted what they considered irrelevant, safe, or dangerous to speak aloud. Alleyn's attention returned to Penworth. The butler's composure was near flawless, but a careful observer could detect small inconsistencies. The hesitation before he spoke, the slightly defensive posture, the way his eyes lingered longer than necessary on certain objects in the room. "Mr. Penworth," Alleyn said softly, "you have known the maestro a long time. Was there anything unusual about his habits lately?" Penworth's hands tightened briefly around a tray he carried. "Inspector, one learns to anticipate certain things with a man like Maestro Hargrave. He was particular. Yes. But I cannot say there was anything out of the ordinary, at least nothing worth mentioning." Alleyn did not press. Silence, as ever, was instructive. He simply observed the slight twitch of the butler's eyelid, the almost imperceptible tightening of the jaw. Something was being held back, not out of malice, but from habit, the ingrained instinct to protect dignity, to avoid scandal, to maintain order. Finally, Alleyn spoke with Lady Amabel, who had returned to the opera house under the pretense of overseeing arrangements for a proper memorial. Her voice remained bright, her smile firm, but her hands were restless beneath the folds of her gown. "Inspector, it is dreadful." "Positively dreadful," she murmured. "I cannot imagine who could harm such a sensitive soul." "Perhaps it was not harm, Lady Amabel," Alleyn suggested quietly. "And yet, even a gentle demise leaves traces. Subtle ones, often imperceptible to all but the most attentive." Amabel's lips pressed into a thin line. She understood, even without Alleyn stating it. The threads of civility had begun to fray. Behind each polite expression, each carefully measured gesture, lay a tension, a fracture. And somewhere in those fractures lay the answer he sought. Alleyn withdrew to a quiet corner of the opera house where he could watch without interference. The performers and staff carried on with rehearsals, with whispered consultations, with the polite avoidance of uncomfortable truth. Each movement, each glance, each carefully chosen word was a piece of a larger, quieter puzzle. The inspector's mind catalogued, weighed, and filed them all like delicate musical notes held in suspension. He understood, as he often did, that the answers would not emerge from confrontation, nor from questioning alone. They would emerge from the subtle contradictions, the silences, the nuances of human behavior observed over time. In this house of polished surfaces and restrained elegance, the truth would reveal itself only to the patient, the perceptive, and the quietly persistent. Alleyn had no doubt he would be that observer. Alleyn lingered in the opera house long after the rehearsals had resumed in muted form. The performers carried on with a careful, almost ritualized routine, their eyes avoiding certain rooms, their movements circumspect. But it was not the artists who drew his attention now. It was the servants, those quiet, vigilant observers who moved like shadows along corridors, unnoticed yet acutely aware of every imperfection in the household's choreography. He found himself near the green room, where a small group of stagehands and wardrobe assistants were gathered, their voices low, each word chosen with care. Their faces were calm, but Alleyn, trained to read nuance, detected the tiny fissures in their restraint. A lifted brow, a brief hesitation, the subtle shift of posture when one spoke too closely to another. A young dresser, thin and pale, emerged from behind a rack of costumes. She curtsied lightly, aware of the inspector's presence, yet did not avert her eyes entirely. "Inspector," she said softly, "I do not know if I ought to speak." "Your discretion is appreciated," Alleyn replied. "But I assure you, what is observed in the proper spirit of truth can be shared without harm. Were there any irregularities you noticed before Maestro Hargrave's death?" The girl glanced toward the other servants as if seeking silent permission, then back at Alleyn. "Nothing. Nothing that one could mention aloud. Yet..." Her voice trailed, delicate and uncertain, as though the weight of the unspoken pressed upon her chest. He was restless lately, very particular about who entered certain rooms. Sometimes he would send people away, even those who had always been welcome. Alleyn's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "And did you notice anyone who disregarded his instructions?" The dresser hesitated, then shook her head. "No one. We are careful. We must be." From the shadows, Penworth emerged, his face composed as ever. He did not speak, but his presence alone sufficed. Alleyn studied the butler's posture, the imperceptible tension in his shoulders. He had seen this before, the silent sentinel, holding back a truth neither deceitful nor malicious, merely prudent. "You see, Inspector," Penworth said finally, his voice measured and low, "there are matters one must never mention, not because they are unimportant, but because words may damage more than silence." Alleyn inclined his head, acknowledging both the wisdom and the frustration inherent in such a statement. He knew that the servants of a household like this often held the keys to understanding precisely because they were trained to notice, remember, and protect. But they also knew the limits of speech, of what might be uttered without consequence. "And yet," Alleyn said softly, "even silence leaves traces. A glance, a hesitation, a mannerism. These are the pieces of a puzzle as surely as words." The dresser's eyes widened slightly, as though realizing she had already provided more than she intended. Penworth's lips twitched faintly, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement. The others remained still, their eyes focused on invisible points across the room. Alleyn's gaze swept over them once more, cataloguing. One of the stagehands lingered near the door, his expression guarded. The costume designer adjusted a hem with a slight tremor of her fingers. A prop master's eyes darted toward the rehearsal room, then away. Each small movement was a whisper of knowledge, an unintentional admission of awareness. Alleyn allowed the silence to hang between them, patient and exacting. He did not ask for more. He simply observed, as he always did. In the quiet world of service and propriety, the truth often revealed itself in the smallest of gestures, and Alleyn, calm and unhurried, waited for it to reveal itself fully. By mid-afternoon, he withdrew, leaving the servants to their careful routines, their secrets preserved beneath layers of discretion. But the impression remained. The house itself knew more than any guest, more than any performer. The servants' knowledge, though hidden, was tangible. It lingered in the air, in the alignment of chairs, the gentle rustle of costumes, the faint echo of footsteps down polished corridors. Alleyn walked slowly through the main auditorium, his eyes tracing the empty seats. Each observer, Each silent witness was part of the larger symphony, one that would soon reveal its dissonance. And somewhere in the measured calm of this house, the truth waited quietly, as inevitable as the final note of an unfinished opera. Alleyn returned to the opera house the following morning, not as a guest nor an observer, but as a quiet investigator, moving through the familiar corridors with the ease of a man who has long studied human patterns. The air was thick with faint traces of perfume and varnish, an aroma that somehow carried both elegance and unease. Every door, every corner seemed to hum with routine, the habits of the living lingering in the absence of the dead. He made his way to Hargrave's study, a small, darkened room off the rehearsal hall. The desk was neatly arranged, papers stacked with meticulous care, a single fountain pen resting atop a sheet of manuscript. Alleyn's eyes scanned the room, noting the subtle signs of ritual, the careful folding of letters, the placement of the inkpot at a precise angle, the faint indentation on the blotter where the maestro had rested his hand. It was here, among the remnants of daily habit, that Alleyn's attention was drawn to a minor irregularity. A small music box, ordinarily perched on a corner shelf, had been moved slightly forward, its surface catching the light in an unusual way. It was insignificant to anyone else, yet Alleyn recognized it immediately, a deviation from the maestro's customary order. He lifted the music box gently, noting the faint scratch on the underside. A mark of hurried handling, perhaps. Inside, a tiny mechanism ticked as though in quiet defiance of the surrounding stillness. Alleyn's gaze lingered on it, and his mind began to trace the habits it suggested. Hargrave had wound the box each morning at precisely 8 o'clock. If it had been moved, if the rhythm had been disturbed, it might have caused more than a simple momentary irritation. It might have created a tension that stretched to the breaking point. A knock at the door drew his attention. Penworth entered quietly, holding a small bundle of letters. "Inspector, these were found in the maestro's desk," he said, placing them on the polished surface without comment. Alleyn examined them carefully. Most were mundane, correspondence with patrons, rehearsal schedules, minor notes on performance technique. But one letter, folded with the exact precision of Hargrave's habit, appeared unusual. The envelope was unsealed, the handwriting unfamiliar. Alleyn noted the way the folds betrayed care, almost insistence in the sender's hand. He did not open it immediately. First, he observed Penworth, who had stepped back into the shadows of the room. The butler's posture was deliberate, restrained, and yet Alleyn caught a subtle shift. A glance, a fleeting hesitation, a recognition that the inspector had noticed something he had not intended to reveal. Alleyn opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a note written in elegant, precise script. "It cannot continue. The final act must end differently." No signature, no indication of who had sent it. Yet its placement, inside the desk, among the carefully catalogued letters, was deliberate. The timing, the phrasing, the insistence on alteration. It suggested not mere commentary, but interference, a quiet intrusion into the maestro's rituals, an effort to unsettle him. Alleyn replaced the letter with care, allowing its presence to linger as a silent witness. He returned to the music box, touching its mechanism lightly. Habit and disruption, he thought, could be far more revealing than confession. One needed only to observe which routines were respected, which violated. A soft noise from the hallway caused him to glance up. Claudia Bellamy had entered, her expression guarded. She did not speak immediately, merely watched him with the same delicate tension he had noted in previous encounters. "I thought perhaps there was something you would like me to see," she said, her voice careful. Alleyn inclined his head. "Observation comes first, Miss Bellamy. Understanding follows." She nodded, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. He did not press further, but the unspoken understanding passed between them. Even minor deviations from the maestro's meticulous habits, a shifted music box, a misdirected letter, could signal forces far larger than a single performer or servant. Alleyn's mind catalogued each detail, each irregularity, each faint ripple in the fabric of daily routine. In this house, in this carefully orchestrated world, the smallest gesture carried weight, and in the careful orchestration of lives, a single note misplaced could spell catastrophe. As he left the study, the music box ticking softly behind him, Alleyn understood that the answer was not in grand gestures or dramatic revelations. It was here, in ritual, in precision, in the tiny, unremarked deviations of ordinary life. The house, he thought, had begun to speak. One only had to listen. The morning after Alan's quiet discoveries, the Winthrop Opera House carried a new tension. Subtle yet insistent, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the previous day's tragedy. Rehearsals continued, but they were muted, precise, and shadowed with caution. Even the music seemed to hesitate before the next note, as though the building itself had learned discretion. Alleyn observed from a discreet corner of the auditorium, his attention drawn less to the overt performance than to the nuances of those on stage and behind it. Claudia Bellamy moved with the precision of habit, yet each phrase she sang bore the faint tremor of inner unrest. Lionel Dane, the conductor, maintained his rigid posture, but Alleyn noted the tension in his hands as they hovered over the baton. Even the stage hands, usually invisible in their movements, betrayed the slightest hesitation in adjusting props or checking lighting. It was Penworth who first spoke of the new disturbance in that measured tone he had perfected over years of service. "Inspector," he said quietly, "there has been an alteration. One of the rehearsal scores is missing." Alleyn raised an eyebrow, his gaze scanning the orchestra pit and the side corridors. "Missing?" he repeated. "From where?" "From Maestro Hargrave's private collection," Penworth replied. "I noticed it last evening, but thought perhaps it had been moved for practice. This morning it is gone entirely. I cannot say by whom." Alleyn's mind catalogued the information, each element aligning with earlier observations. The shifted music box, the intrusive letter, the subtle disruption of ritual. Nothing had been overt, nothing had screamed of malice, yet a pattern was beginning to emerge. Someone was quietly manipulating the flow of the opera, interfering with the maestro's work, unsettling the performers. He moved slowly to inspect the rehearsal room. The piano remained as it had been the previous day. The music box ticked faintly in the corner, but the absence of the score, neatly catalogued, yet now vanished, was more telling than any flourish of evidence. Claudia approached him cautiously, her hands folded over the edge of her skirt. "Inspector," she said, voice low, "I thought perhaps the missing score was simply misplaced. Maestro Hargrave was particular. It could have been moved for convenience." Alleyn did not answer immediately. He observed her closely, the way her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve, the faint upward tension of her eyebrows, the careful avoidance of his gaze. Her composure was nearly perfect, yet the smallest tells betrayed her. She was aware of more than she admitted, or at least she believed she was. A soft cough drew Alleyn's attention to Lionel Dane, who had paused in the orchestra pit. His eyes flickered briefly toward the doorway, then returned to his silent counting of beats. Alleyn noted the way the conductor's jaw tightened. A small, almost imperceptible reaction, yet it suggested a consciousness of disruption, a recognition that something unseen was at work. Penworth lingered in the shadows, silent as if he had already catalogued the events, but would not share them unless asked directly. Alleyn approached him. "You observed the score's absence first?" "Yes, Inspector," Penworth replied. "I'm aware of how Maestro Hargrave's routines influence those around him. The missing score is unusual, unsettling." Alleyn nodded. He understood the significance of what Penworth described. It was not merely a piece of music. It was a disruption to the maestro's carefully maintained order, a fracture in the daily ritual that governed the opera's delicate ecosystem. Whoever had removed it understood the leverage contained in such minutiae. The inspector returned to his observation point, letting the subtle energy of the house wash over him. Every glance exchanged between performers, every quiet shift of a hand, every hesitant step of the stagehands became part of a growing pattern. Alleyn did not yet name the culprit, nor did he need to. The evidence lay in the invisible currents of behavior, in the silent acknowledgement that something had changed, something had begun to fracture more deeply. Even Claudia's eyes, bright yet anxious, revealed the faintest shadow of worry. Alleyn knew her attentiveness to the maestro's habits had made her privy to the unrest long before any others had sensed it. And he knew, too, that the subtle manipulations, the missing score, the altered rituals, the carefully worded letter, were merely the overture to a deeper, more personal disruption. As the afternoon rehearsal continued, a low murmur of tension hummed through the house. Alleyn allowed it to settle into his mind like dust in sunlight, noting, recording, and understanding. The opera, the performers, the servants, each played a part in a drama not yet visible, a mystery unfolding in whispers, in silences, in the faintest dissonances of routine. And somewhere, hidden in these small disturbances, the truth waited, patient and inexorable, for the careful eye to discern it. By late afternoon, the quiet hum of the opera house had settled into a more familiar rhythm, though the undercurrent of unease remained. Alleyn sat alone in a shadowed corner of the auditorium, observing the rehearsal from a distance. He did not take notes, nor did he speak. His mind worked in its usual methodical way, assembling fragments of behavior into patterns that others might miss entirely. He recalled Claudia Bellamy's measured anxiety, the slight tremor in her hands as she recited the opening aria, her eyes constantly flicking toward the stage door. He remembered Lionel Dane's taut jaw, the subtle flinch when the missing score was mentioned, and Penworth's silence, deliberate and protective, as though he carried knowledge he was sworn to conceal. Each detail, seemingly minor, aligned with an unseen rhythm, a narrative that had yet to make itself explicit. Alleyn reflected on the letter he had found in Hargrave's desk. It cannot continue. The final act must end differently. The handwriting, deliberate and precise, suggested someone confident, someone intimately familiar with the opera's progress, and someone who knew the maestro well enough to influence him without confrontation. He considered the disruptions to ritual, the shifted music box, the absence of the score, the subtle tension among the performers. Each was a deliberate fracture in the maestro's carefully maintained order. To most observers, these would appear trivial, perhaps even accidental. To Alleyn, they were symptoms of a much deeper pressure, a psychological manipulation aimed at destabilizing the household from within. Alleyn's gaze returned to Claudia. She carried herself with disciplined grace, but every movement betrayed a vigilance cultivated under long acquaintance with the maestro's exacting temperament. She was observant, cautious, and entirely aware of how deviation from the expected order might ripple through the delicate balance of this artistic world. He thought, too, of Dane. The conductor's rigid control over timing and phrasing masked the subtle anxiety he now exhibited. There was pride in his profession, certainly, but also an awareness of the fragility of the structures that governed their rehearsals, and of how those structures had been quietly threatened. Alleyn's intuition, as it often did, settled like dust over these observations. He did not yet speak, nor did he act. He allowed the patterns to crystallize in his mind, to clarify themselves through repetition and reflection. The disruption was deliberate, targeted, subtle. The motive would emerge from the interplay of personality, habit, and opportunity, not from violence, nor from theatricality, but from the very human impulses that lie beneath refinement and civility. He rose and walked slowly through the backstage corridors, noting once more the minor, telling details. The slight disarray of a costume, rack, the angle of a music stand, the faint imprint of a hand on a polished surface. Nothing overt, nothing accusatory, and yet collectively they were far more revealing than any confession. As he paused near the rehearsal room doorway, Alleyn allowed himself a quiet reflection. The opera house, with its ordered chaos and carefully maintained etiquette, was not merely a stage for art. It was a stage for human behavior. And in such a place, the smallest deviation, the subtlest hesitation, could signal a mind bent toward extremes, ambition, fear, or perhaps resentment. Alleyn understood now, as he often did before revealing a truth to others, that the final act of his investigation would not rely on evidence alone. It would rely on insight, the capacity to read character as one reads music, to sense tension as one senses rhythm, to perceive the unseen pressures that bend human behavior toward consequence. He stepped back into the auditorium, allowing the muted strains of rehearsal to wash over him. The performers moved, the stagehands lingered, and the house itself seemed to breathe, as though aware of the hidden currents within. Alleyn's mind catalogued, weighed, and considered. He did not yet know the identity of the person responsible, but he understood the method, the motive, and the subtle orchestration of influence that had set the tragic sequence in motion. And he knew, with quiet certainty, that the answer would reveal itself not in force or confrontation, but in the gradual unraveling of habit, ritual, and carefully guarded emotion. Alleyn settled into his observation once more, patient as ever. The music continued, the house whispered, and the truth, like dust in sunlight, waited for the precise moment to settle. The evening air outside the opera house carried the faint tang of rain, though inside the auditorium the house had returned to its familiar, polished quiet. Alleyn moved with unobtrusive precision, observing the performers as they rehearsed in near silence, their voices and gestures measured, the air between them taut with restraint. He found Claudia Bellamy in a small, dimly lit corner of the stage, adjusting a scarf around her neck with a nervous delicacy. Her movements were precise, yet her posture betrayed tension. Alleyn approached slowly, allowing the silence to precede him, giving her the opportunity to settle herself. "Miss Bellamy," he said softly, "may I have a word?" She inclined her head, a faint flush coloring her cheeks. "Of course, Inspector." He gestured toward a secluded passage behind the stage, one that led to a tiny room used for prop storage. "This will be quiet," he said, his voice low and even. "I wish to understand a few matters more clearly, without disturbing the others." Claudia followed, her steps measured, betraying neither haste nor hesitation. Once inside, the narrow room seemed to compress time itself. The faint scent of aged wood and varnish hung in the air, and the single lamp cast a warm, intimate glow. Alleyn observed her carefully. Her hands were steady now, but her eyes flickered toward the doorway, as though expecting an unseen presence. "Miss Bellamy," Alleyn began, "you have been observant these past days. I note your vigilance, your careful attention to the maestro's habits." She nodded, her lips pressed together. "I learned to notice. It was necessary. He demanded it, and I respected him." Alleyn's gaze did not waver. "And yet, even the most careful observation can conceal certain truths. I wish only to understand, not accuse. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to the maestro's death?" Claudia paused, choosing her words with painstaking care. "Unusual? Perhaps, in retrospect, yes. But at the time I thought it merely temperament. Maestro Hargrave was delicate, sensitive. Minor things seemed important to him, but they seemed minor to us. Alleyn inclined his head slowly. Minor things often carry disproportionate weight, especially in those with a meticulous nature. A moved object, a delayed note, a letter unwelcome in its timing. Such things may seem insignificant, yet they resonate profoundly. Claudia's eyes widened fractionally, the smallest acknowledgement of recognition passing between them. "Yes," she whispered. Perhaps I noticed more than I should have. But it did not occur to me that it would." Her voice trailed, unfinished, the implication unspoken but understood. Alleyn did not press further. He allowed the silence to expand, letting her thoughts surface in small, unguarded movements. A shift of the hands, a breath held too long, a glance toward the door. "You have been honest, Miss Bellamy," he said finally. "More than you may realize. There is no need for dramatics. Understanding comes from observation, not accusation. I merely wish to see what is hidden in plain sight." Claudia's composure returned slowly, her tension relaxing fractionally. "I understand, Inspector. I will answer what I can, in the same spirit." Alleyn inclined his head again. "Very well. You have served the maestro with devotion, and I admire that. Let us proceed gently, as the circumstances require." He stepped back, allowing her a moment's relief, yet keeping his watchful gaze, perceptive of every subtle inflection. In this quiet, private exchange, Alleyn gleaned more than he could have in the public theater of interviews. The truth often revealed itself not in confrontation, but in the calm intervals between words. When they returned to the rehearsal hall, the performers continued without pause, their motions measured, as if nothing had changed. Yet Alleyn knew that the smallest disturbances, the missing score, the altered routines, the unspoken observations, had begun to exert their influence. And in the silence of observation, the invisible threads of motive, opportunity, and subtle coercion had begun to converge. Alleyn's intuition, settled like dust in sunlight, had begun to discern the shape of the unseen hand behind the quiet tragedy. The house, polished and elegant, carried on. Yet behind its ordered facade, the truth lingered, patient and inexorable, waiting for the precise moment to be acknowledged. The drawing room of the Winthrop Opera House, usually reserved for private consultations and small gatherings of patrons, now bore the weight of quiet expectation. The performers, patrons and staff, had assembled at Lady Amabel Carriage's gentle insistence, each aware of the day's slow, unfolding tragedy. Alleyn moved among them with his usual calm assurance, noting gestures, postures, and the subtle dissonances of polite conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice soft, but carrying the authority of quiet intellect. It is sometimes said that the truth demands spectacle. I prefer, however, to let it arrive in its natural form, unhurried, deliberate, and precise. There were murmurs of curiosity, polite coughs, but no one interrupted. Alleyn allowed a moment's silence to settle, drawing attention without force, letting the room itself hold the tension. He gestured lightly toward Claudia Bellamy. Miss Bellamy has been observant, as she must be in her role. Her vigilance has helped clarify details that might otherwise have remained unseen. And yet, he paused, allowing the slight raising of eyebrows and subtle shifts in posture to punctuate his words. Even the most attentive eye cannot see everything. There are subtleties revealed only in behavior, in small departures from routine, in the quiet manipulations that do not announce themselves. Alleyn's gaze shifted imperceptibly to Lionel Dane, whose posture remained rigid, though his hands betrayed a faint tremor. The missing score, the carefully placed letter, the tiny disruptions to ritual. These were not accidents nor simple eccentricities. They were deliberate acts designed to influence, to control, and ultimately to unbalance Maestro Hargrave in the final days of his life. A faint, almost inaudible murmur ran through the room, the polite shock of realization tempered by social restraint. Alleyn continued, his tone calm, measured, and almost gentle. The person responsible was close to him, yet not in the obvious way, not through aggression or overt confrontation. Rather through subtle, persistent interference with his habits, his routines, his carefully ordered world. He allowed his gaze to linger on the faces before him, letting the weight of his words settle like soft dust. And the individual who did this understood that in a household governed by decorum and exacting standards, the smallest disturbance could produce profound consequences. It was this knowledge, applied quietly, with precision, that led to the tragedy we now mourn. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Alleyn's eyes softened, but the clarity of his observation remained intact. "The person responsible," he said finally, "is Miss Eleanor Faraday." A slight shift in the air, barely perceptible, as all eyes turned toward the young pianist who had remained largely in the background throughout the investigation. She stood, pale but composed, her hands folded neatly before her. Alleyn continued, his tone firm, yet restrained. Miss Faraday acted not out of malice in the conventional sense, nor through overt anger. Her actions were rooted in obsession, in a desire to impose order according to her own understanding of perfection. The subtle manipulations of letters, scores, and small rituals were intended to guide, to shape the maestro's final compositions, and they succeeded in ways she perhaps did not anticipate. Eleanor's eyes, calm yet shadowed with quiet dread, met Alleyn's. "I did not intend," she began, her voice measured, almost rehearsed, but trailing off. Alleyn inclined his head slightly. Intent, in matters of subtle manipulation, is often less relevant than effect. The result of your interventions, however carefully reasoned, produced the outcome we now face. And yet, he added, his tone softening further, there is no necessity for theatrics, no need for denial or hysteria. Acknowledgement is sufficient. The room remained silent, the air heavy with comprehension. Alleyn's method, gentle and precise, had revealed the truth without spectacle, without accusation shouted or dramatized. The resolution, though unsettling, carried the dignity and restraint befitting the house, its inhabitants, and the memory of Maestro Hargrave. Alleyn allowed a final moment's pause, letting the quiet gravity of the revelation settle. Then he withdrew, letting Eleanor remain with the knowledge of her actions, the consequences implicit, the acknowledgement unspoken, yet understood. Outside, the night fell gently over the opera house. Inside, the faint strains of music lingered in empty corridors, a soft, haunting echo of what had been and what could never be repeated. The days that followed the revelation of Eleanor Faraday's subtle manipulations passed with a quiet inevitability, as though the opera house itself exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Life resumed its routines, though every movement, every gesture, carried the faint imprint of awareness. The performers continued their rehearsals, their voices polished yet measured, the intervals between notes weighted with reflection. Eleanor remained in the house under the watchful eyes of Lady Amabel, who, with a practiced balance of kindness and propriety, ensured that no scandal would erupt into overt turmoil. She moved among the staff and performers with her customary grace, her glances carrying gentle caution rather than accusation. The young pianist, pale yet composed, accepted her position with quiet resignation. Alleyn had allowed the revelation to unfold with minimal disruption, and the consequences, though significant, were handled with discretion. Alleyn observed this unfolding from the wings, noting the subtleties of human behavior in their natural habitat. Claudia Bellamy, though outwardly composed, bore a faint tension in her shoulders, the shadow of the maestro's absence and the knowledge of Eleanor's culpability lingering in her awareness. Lionel Dane maintained a strict composure, though Alleyn could detect the invisible weight pressing upon him, the recognition that art, habit, and human frailty had intersected with tragic precision. The law, it seemed, required only the minimum involvement. Eleanor would be guided through necessary formalities, yet her punishment was tempered by circumstance, by intent, and by the absence of overt malice. In this world of etiquette and refinement, justice was often subtle, and consequences could be rendered with the same quiet efficiency that had governed the crime itself. Alleyn allowed himself a brief reflection on the nature of such justice. It was not dramatic. It did not demand spectacle. It was a thing of measured intervals, of proportional acknowledgement, and of social and psychological equilibrium restored. Yet he understood, as he always did, that the irony lay not in punishment or relief, but in the precision with which a seemingly minor act, an alteration of routine, had set the tragedy in motion. Even the servants, steadfast in their discretion, observed the new balance with careful attention. Penworth, ever the silent sentinel, continued his watch, neither judgmental nor vindictive, merely aware of the fragile equilibrium and the necessity of preserving it. In the small gestures of service, the subtle reordering of routine, the house absorbed the lesson that order and chaos exist side by side, often differentiated only by the delicate eye of observation. Alleyn wandered once more through the familiar corridors, tracing the familiar echoes of music and movement. He noted with quiet satisfaction that the invisible patterns he had discerned were now restored, if only partially. The house, the performers, the staff, all had resumed their roles, subtly altered yet composed, their awareness sharpened by the experience. In this resolution, Alleyn found both justice and irony intertwined. The minor manipulations that had wrought the maestro's quiet demise had produced consequences, not catastrophic, yet irreversible. The elegance of the house and the refinement of its inhabitants preserved dignity, even as human flaws had revealed themselves in delicate, consequential ways. And so the opera house continued, its routines resuming like a carefully measured symphony, each note precise, each gesture deliberate, each silence weighted with understanding. In this world, justice was not a shout, it was a measured acknowledgement, a return to equilibrium that left the traces of human error visible, yet gracefully contained. The opera house was still once more, the soft glow of late afternoon light filtering through the tall windows, catching the dust motes in a slow, luminous dance. Alleyn walked the empty corridors with deliberate pace, listening not to voices but to echoes, the faint hum of past rehearsals, the shadow of applause, the lingering resonance of Hargrave's life and artistry. He paused at the doorway of the maestro's study, observing the untouched desk, the music sheets arranged with precision, the small ticking music box in its corner. The letter, once so revealing, had been placed back in its envelope, returned to the routine that Hargrave himself might have preferred. Everything was orderly again. Yet in that order, the faint memory of disruption remained, subtle as a tremor beneath polished marble. Alleyn considered the threads of human behavior he had traced, the invisible tensions that had led to tragedy. Eleanor Faraday, delicate in appearance yet exacting in intent, had exercised a quiet influence that neither malice nor malcontent could entirely explain. She had sought perfection, imposed her will upon a world not designed for it, and in doing so had unleashed consequences she could not fully control. He reflected on the performers, the servants, the patrons. Each had played their part in the delicate equilibrium of the opera house. The smallest gestures, the briefest evasions, the silent observations of those who serve rather than perform, all had contributed to the unfolding of events. It was a reminder, Alleyn thought, that human lives are governed as much by the unseen as by the overt, by restraint as much as by action. Stepping into the auditorium, he allowed his gaze to linger over the empty seats, the polished stage, the instruments waiting silently. Here, where beauty and discipline converged, he perceived a truth beyond justice or blame, that human ambition, observation, and obsession could shape lives as subtly and inexorably as the rhythm of music itself. Alleyn's hand rested lightly on the polished rail, and he breathed in the faint scent of varnish, paper, and lingering perfume. In that quiet, reflective moment, he understood that the resolution of a tragedy often leaves no fanfare, no dramatic closure. It leaves only acknowledgement, comprehension, and the soft, inescapable presence of consequence. He allowed himself a small, imperceptible smile, not of triumph, but of recognition. The house, the people, the routines, all had resumed their ordered existence, yet with a heightened awareness, a sharpened sensitivity to the invisible forces that guide human lives. As the light faded gently across the auditorium, Alleyn turned away, his steps quiet, his mind attuned to the subtle rhythms of the world. Outside, the city awaited, indifferent and constant, yet within the walls of the Winthrop Opera House, the echoes of what had transpired would linger. They would linger. In the silence between notes, in the careful placement of music sheets, in the vigilance of those who observe. And in that enduring quiet, Alleyn found the final, unspoken truth that life, like the unfinished opera, moves forward with dignity, with subtlety, and with the inexorable weight of consequence. A truth perceived not in spectacle, but in quiet, deliberate attention. The inspector walked on, the fading light marking the end of one tragedy, in the beginning of the ongoing, ever-observed symphony of human life.